Muchos filósofos y pensadores que defienden el liberalismo como el camino correcto para construir una economía más próspera y de mayor igualdad para todos. Hay otros que van todavía más allá del liberalismo. Por ejemplo, hay un pequeño grupo que se define como anarcocapitalistas, sí, anarquistas que defienden la absoluta libertad del mercado. Quizás uno de los más importantes es Walter Block. Él es economista estadounidense de la escuela austríaca, un importante teórico del anarcocapitalismo. Ha escrito cientos de artículos sobre este tema, artículos académicos, artículos también periodísticos. Tiene un libro que ha causado una gran polémica defendiendo lo indefendible. Y Walter Block acaba de recibir el premio Una Vida por la Libertad 2023 que otorga el grupo Caminos de la Libertad. Voy a conversar con él en este momento en el idioma inglés. Professor Block, thank you very much for being with us. It is, first of all, congratulations on being awarded the Life Merit Award of Caminos de la Libertad. But tell me, not everyone knows what a anarcho-capitalist is, and you define yourself as a anarcho-capitalist. What are you? What does that mean?
Well, I'm more of a philosophical anarchist. I don't believe in throwing stones or shooting anyone or anything like that. It stems more from the philosophy of libertarianism. And the philosophy of libertarianism, the idea is the non-aggression principle. Do not initiate violence against anyone. And libertarianism is a theory of what is just law. And what just law is, there should be no murder, no rape, no theft, no arson, no fraud, and that's it. Anyone can do anything they want, and all interaction should be voluntary.
Okay, no aggression. But is the role of the state aggressive sometimes, of the government?
Not sometimes, always. Necessarily. Why? Because they demand that you pay taxes, and you didn't agree to. Look, if I demand $100 from you, and you haven't agreed to pay me $100, I'm a thief. Yes. I'm a extortionist. People say, well, you live in Mexico, and therefore you've agreed to be paying taxes to the Mexican government.
I didn't. They take it.
Or you live in the U.S., or you live in Canada, or wherever you live, but that's a circular argument. It assumes that just because you live somewhere, you're obligated to pay taxes. The only time I'm obligated to pay anything is if you lend me $100, and I'm obligated to pay you back the $100. That's an obligation. But otherwise, the government is necessarily violating the non-aggression principle because they demand that you pay them money and you haven't agreed to do so.
Are taxes a form of theft?
Yes, taxes are a form of theft. Now, people say, well, anarchism is theoretical or it's unlikely to ever occur, but we do have international anarchy. See, the idea here is you and I might get into a fight, and we need the Mexican government, since we're in Mexico, to make sure we behave. However, Mexico and Burundi, to just pick some country, might get into a fight, and if we're not anarchists, we believe in world government. But there is no world government, and most people don't favor world government. And if we had world government and it was democratic, India and China would pretty much run everything. So I think most people are anarchists, at least in the international sense, since they don't want to have a world government.
You say that taxes can be considered theft. Now, you've already said that you're an anarchist, a real anarchist. But let me go back in time. You were considered a leftist when you were young. Tell me about your personal development. And I know that Ayn Rand, this philosopher, was very influential in your life. Tell me about your personal development from leftist anarchy to anarcho-capitalism.
Well, I started off as I'm Jewish. I was born in Brooklyn. Everyone there was a lefty.
Yes.
And I was more interested in girls and sports than in politics. But I just sort of, became a lefty. I was on the high school track team with Bernie Sanders, and my views and his views were roughly the same.
Probably the most leftist member of Congress nowadays.
Of the Senate, yeah, I would say. AOC might give him a run for his money, but she's a congressman. He's a senator.
Ocasio, because not everyone knows them in Mexico. Yeah.
Right. No, I would say he's the furthest leftist senator, and we're still in touch, sort of buddies. We're high school friends. And then what happened is I was at Brooklyn College, and Ayn Rand came to lecture, and I came to boo her and hiss at her because she favored free enterprise, and everyone knows that free enterprise leads to starvation and it's evil.
Well, that's what people were led to believe.
Yes, absolutely. And in those days, you didn't try to cancel speakers. It was a polite booing. Nowadays, people aren't allowed to speak like...
if you go to certain colleges, I'm sure they wouldn't let you speak.
That's true. I've been canceled by 2 or 3 places, and Charles Murray, for example, went to speak somewhere and they wouldn't let him speak, and they used violence against him. We didn't have that. So anyway, after the Ayn Rand lecture at Brooklyn College, they announced that there was a lunch in her honor, and anyone could come, even if you disagreed, and I wanted to convert her to socialism. So there was this long, long table. Ayn Rand was sitting at the head, and Nathaniel Brannan and Leonard Peikoff and Alan Greenspan were there, and the only empty place was at the other end of the table, and I sat there. And I turned to my neighbor and said, you know, socialism is the way to go. And he said, well, I don't really know that much about it, but the people who do are at the other end of the table. So I was 20 years old, Brandon was 35, Rand maybe 50, and I stuck my head in between Ayn Rand's and Nathaniel Brannan's, and I said, there's a socialist here who wants to debate someone on socialism and capitalism. And they said, who was it? I said, me. Brandon was very, very nice. He said, there's no room at the table here, but I'll come to the other end of the table and I'll talk to you on 2 conditions. One, you have to promise not to let this conversation lapse with this one discussion, but we continue until we settle it. And 2, read 2 books that I'll recommend. One book was Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand. The other was Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt. I read those books and I couldn't put Atlas Shrugged down. I've read it every 10 years since and got more out of it. I think it's the best novel ever written. And I went to his house and Ayn Rand's house, and I became a limited government libertarian, sort of like Hayek or Milton Friedman.
Although anarcocapitalism goes more than that.
Oh, yeah, I'm not an anarcho-capitalist yet.
No, okay.
But I'm a libertarian, minimal government person, where government should make sure that personal safety for the citizens.
What's supposed to be the role of the state? What would you accept as a role of the state? 0.
0.
So you are a narco-capitalist.
I am now, but at that time, I would have accepted the Ayn Rand, Ron Paul, Robert Nozick kind of a view.
Isn't government necessary?
They all think government is necessary, but very limited. Armies to keep foreign bad guys away from us, police to keep local bad guys away from us, not to stop victimless crimes, but to make sure there's no violence.
If I use drugs, it shouldn't be the role of the government.
Right.
Yeah, to do with me whatever. They shouldn't put me in jail for doing harm to myself.
Drugs, sex, pornography, prostitution.
You accept pornography and prostitution.
Well, I don't accept it. I'm not a big fan of it.
Okay.
But the question is, should you go to jail for it? And remember, libertarianism is a theory not of morality, but only of what is just law. And just law means if you're a consenting adult and you do get drunk or something like that on alcohol, we used to have prohibition of alcohol, and put people in jail for drinking too much wine or beer. Happily, we don't do that anymore. And happily, in the U.S., marijuana is now legalized in most states, not only for medicinal purposes, but for recreational purposes. And in Oregon, they even legalized cocaine, which I think is very libertarian. So the idea here is you have armies not to export democracy, but to safeguard the country, police, and courts to determine who's who, guilty or innocent, and that's about it.
Does a woman or a man have the right to sell himself for prostitution? You think you think that's the government shouldn't intervene? And in most of the U.S., prostitution is actually forbidden.
Yes, I think a man, a gigolo, or a woman should be able to sell herself or himself. I even go further. I think you should be able to sell yourself.
In slavery.
Voluntary slavery.
That has been one of your most controversial issues, one of your most controversial ideas. Yeah. But I remember once you told me about it and you made it sound reasonable. Will you explain it again?
I got into a lot of trouble with the New York Times over this.
I remember that, a whole campaign, in fact.
Right? Take the following case. My son, God forbid, who I love, has a horrible disease, and it'll cost $50 million to cure him.
And you
I don't have anything like $50 million. You are very rich. You make Bill Gates look like impoverished.
Okay.
And you've long wanted to have me as your slave. I can pick cotton. I can give you economics lessons, and you can whip me if you don't like what I'm doing, and you can even kill me. This is not a 7-year agreement. This is actual slavery. I gain because I value my son's life more than my liberty. You gain because you value my servitude more than the 50 million. Is this a valid contract? Well, among libertarians, this is a very divisive issue.
Yes, I know that.
Rothbard opposes it. Robert Nozick and I favor this as a legal contract. And we say anything between consenting adults. Look, I bought this tie for 20 bucks. I valued it more than 20 bucks. So I made a profit. The person who sold me this tie valued it less than 20 bucks.
I think it's the first time I've seen you with a tie, in fact. You don't wear them very often.
He made a profit also. Every voluntary interaction is profitable, at least ex ante, and so is voluntary slavery. Now, what the New York Times did is they said I favored actual slavery. Actual slavery is an abomination. Actual slavery is perhaps the next worst thing than mass murder. And I have a long paper trail of favoring reparations to the present black people for slavery of their great-grandfathers. So how can I favor actual slavery when I favor reparations for slavery? So it's a big confusion.
What about health, a health system? Would you agree to have a government-run health system or an education system?
Well, you know, I have a niece, a young woman who's in her late 30s and was just told that she has cancer, breast cancer. And to me, it brings comfort to understand why we have that. And my theory is the reason we have it is due to government. If not, first of all, government takes half the GDP. So if they didn't take half the GDP, we'd be twice as rich. And then what do they do with their half of the GDP? They make it difficult for the rest of us to earn a living. So if they didn't do that, we'd be quadruple as rich as we are. Well, there's an aphorism in economics, wealthier is healthier. So if we were quadruply richer than we now are, we might have cured cancer. And the second reason is affirmative action. What they do now in the medical schools is they take people not on the basis of their ability, but on the basis of their skin color or their internal plumbing. And if they didn't do that, and not only for doctors, but for people who are getting a PhD in chemistry and biology and other areas where it impinges upon cancer. So far from wanting the government to do this, I want government out, because if government were out, we'd have a much better chance of curing cancer or curing stroke.
So you actually believe that we would be better off as a society if government didn't have health insurance or health programs for people, or a public education system?
Absolutely. I mean, we have a doctor shortage. Why do we? I don't know about the Mexican situation, but certainly in the U.S. and Canada, where I'm more familiar, we have a doctor shortage. Why do we have a doctor shortage? Because they just won't allow
more
new
people
medical
to go to school.
They won't allow new medical schools to start. They won't allow extant medical schools to enable more people to come in. And then for foreigners, they demand that the exam be in English. Now, suppose I happen to know a friend of my son, his father was a Korean doctor, and he can never pass the Canadian medical test to become a doctor in Canada. And they said, well, you know, you need to speak English. Well, he'd be perfectly good for Korean patients, and then there are unconscious patients that he could deal with, and then there are interpreters. And yet they keep him out in order to restrict entry, in order to keep their salaries high. This is vicious. This is evil.
Well, Professor Walter Block, it's always good to know that you remain as feisty and that you don't like dogmas, and you make it very, very evident. Thank you very much for this conversation.
Thanks for having me.
Y a usted, amigo, que al vernos y escucharnos hace posible este programa, se lo agradezco también. Eso es todo por hoy, pero no se lo olvide. Nos vemos la próxima.